Last December, a twin-bomb terrorist attack on the city of Volgograd in Russia claimed 34 lives and only buttressed fears that the Sochi Olympic Winter Games could be vulnerable to attack. Joining us now to examine these concerns and the tumultuous relationship between Russia and its neighbors. In Stanford, California, Catherine Stoner, Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. In Waco, Texas, Serhii Kudelia. He's Assistant Professor of Political Science at Baylor University. In New York, New York, Angela Stent, Director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at Georgetown University. And with us here in studio, Matthew Light, Professor at the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the University of Toronto. And it's great to have everybody on the program tonight as we consider one of the most significant issues in the world today. And let's just start, Catherine Stoner, with you in California. Based on what you've seen, heard, read, what you know, how safe is Sochi right now?
I think it's as safe as it's ever been. I think that people should exercise due caution. If they see something, say something. The danger here, of course, is the possibility of not just the normal craziness that can go on around any international sporting event, but the location of the Sochi Games is worrisome in that it's very close to a very restive region of Russia, the North Caucasus area, and specifically Chechnya and Dagestan, where Russia has been battling with Islamic insurgency for over a decade now. Almost 20 years. Sorry,
Serhii Kudelia, I know this is a moot point at this point, but it's still worth asking. Do you think it was a wise decision for the International Olympic Committee, given everything Catherine Stoner just said, to have the Games in Sochi, Russia?
I do not think it was a wise decision. I think given how much attention now has been paid to the security in Sochi, given how much of resources the Russian government has spent on ensuring security of Sochi, and given how many risks there are of terrorist attacks still, despite all of the resources spent, I think financially and from the standpoint of the safety of athletes and spectators, I do not think it was a wise decision to have to award Russia the Winter Olympics.
Matthew, would you weigh in on that, the advisability of having these games in that location at this moment in history?
Well, I'm afraid that although we still don't know what will happen at the Games, people's concerns in advance of them have to some extent been justified by the resurgence of terrorist activity, including the Volgograd incident that you mentioned. So, of course, we all hope that the Games go out without a tragedy or a terrorist attack, but there is cause for concern.
Cause for concern. Angela Stent, would you go further and say it was simply a mistake to put the Games here?
Well, Putin put everything into trying to get these games. Nobody thought actually that Russia was going to get the games in 2007, so he wheedled, cajoled, spoke in English, offered all these things. We also haven't mentioned that Sochi has a subtropical climate. You've seen a picture of all those palm trees there. So it's not only a very bad neighborhood, it's an inappropriate climate really for Winter Olympics. I think it's in the high 40s today, at least by the sea in Sochi. And then, of course, there's all the cost overruns, $51 billion they've spent constructing those facilities. So one hopes that these games go off well without a terrorist incident. But in retrospect, this was, I think, a typical Putin project to show that Russia was back, that Sochi was going to become a world-class tourist destination. And one wonders whether it will have been worth the expense, the expenditures on it.
Well, let me follow up on the terrorist angle with some of our other guests as well. And in doing so, I want to read a quote from earlier this last summer, I guess, from Doku Umarev, the Chechen Islamic militant, who said the following: "I call on you, every mujahid, either in Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, or on the territory of the Caucasus, to use maximum force on the path of Allah to disrupt this satanic dancing on the bones of our ancestors." Serhii, let me start with you on this. Does that kind of a call to arms to you suggest that an attempt at a terrorist attack is inevitable?
I would say that there would be an attempt to conduct a terrorist act either in Sochi itself or outside of Sochi, actually at any point at any town in Russia. If we see an attempt to conduct a terrorist act or a terrorist act itself, that will create a lot of fear and add panic to the spectators and athletes in Sochi. We are seeing similar calls to arms, not only coming from the leaders of the Caucasus Emirate, but we're also seeing that on multiple jihadist websites, which are controlled by these numerous cells, terrorist cells that exist in Dagestan, in Ingushetia, in Kabardino-Balkaria, in all these small republics around North Caucasus, and they're being repeated basically every week with a clear message that the terrorists are ready, they have the capacity, and they show that they have a capacity with the Volgograd explosions. They have a capacity to conduct these terror raids, and they will do that at some point during the Olympic Games.
Catherine Stoner, this part of the world will, of course, be the most intensely guarded and potentially secure part of the world that exists over the next couple of weeks. And yet, in spite of that, do you fear that an attack is inevitable, given those comments from the Chechen Islamic militant leader?
I don't know that a successful attack is inevitable. It's unfortunately possible. I think an attempt is, or maybe several attempts are probably inevitable. The Russians, as Angela mentioned, have put a tremendous amount of money, some of which has been stolen, of course, but have put a tremendous amount of money into these games and into security in particular. They've been aided to a small degree by a few other countries. The U.S. is nervous enough to have a ship in the Black Sea ready to evacuate American athletes as needed. That tells you something, I think. Unfortunately, I think the real danger here is that, Sochi has been under construction since 2007 and rather intensively in the last 6 months in particular. And my concern would be, now I know the main routes into Sochi are relatively well sealed, probably as well sealed as they're going to be. But the problem could be that militants have gotten in as construction workers and have had access to things like explosives for several months now and have been stockpiling them. And so that's a possibility. That is, terrorists are already there and undercover and will, try something as the games go on. We have reports that there are allegedly 2 so-called black widows, that is, relatives, women who are relatives of dead Islamic militants who have allegedly been spotted on the streets of Sochi. So I think that's, a real danger, is that potential terrorists are already there.
Matthew, just follow up on that. This new expression that is out there now, black widows. What are black widows, and are these the people, the black widows, are they the ones who are carrying out or attempting to carry out much of the terrorism that we hear about in this region of the world now?
The Black Widows is the name given to, as Professor Stoner said, the widows of Islamic militants who were killed by the Russian security forces. They certainly aren't responsible for all the terrorist attacks committed in Russia by radical Islamist groups, but they have been responsible for some. And perhaps in particular, they highlight the extreme alienation of many of the ethnic groups in the North Caucasus from the Russian government, and the fact that they're women who are carrying out these terrorist attacks has given them a certain kind of horrible glamour.
Horrible glamour? Is that what you said?
Well, I suppose in the sense that we're more used to thinking of men as being involved in warfare, but in this case it's women who are playing a prominent role in terrorist attacks.
Is their MO suicide bombing or something else?
Often, yes.
Often, yes. Angela Sent, let me go to you with this next question. We of course, started off the program talking about those 2 terrorist attacks that took place in Volgograd, killing 34 people. And as we try to understand how the Russian government might react to future potential terrorist attacks, it might be worthwhile looking back at how they reacted to those 2 terrorist attacks. What was their reaction?
Well, I mean, their reaction was obviously to do whatever they could to, help the people who had been killed. It was obviously to condemn and criticize them. They clearly weren't very well prepared for that. I think we should mention that even though Sochi itself is an armed fortress at the moment, as my colleagues have said, it's quite possible that other terrorist attacks might take place during the Olympics at some other location, maybe not that far from Sochi or maybe further from Sochi in some other Russian cities. Certainly these groups want to call attention to their cause, to their demands for independence, and focusing on the time period when people are in Sochi and heightening the concern of the spectators and the athletes is one of their main goals. And I think the problem in Russia, as we've heard, if you think about two more of these Black Widows, they blew up an aeroplane that was departing Domodedovo Airport in Moscow a few years ago. And the reason they were able to do that was because they bribed their way into getting a ticket at the last moment and getting on the plane. So the problem of corruption, as we've heard, you could have people going into construction sites in Sochi who have bribed their way in. So one of the problems that Russia has in dealing with terrorism is that the corruption of the system there makes it easier for terrorists to operate and to go unnoticed until it's too late.
So, Professor Stan, is it more likely then that we would see a terrorist attack, given how well protected Sochi is at the moment? Is it more likely that we would see an attempt somewhere else in Russia?
I think it's quite possible that we'll see an attempt somewhere else in Russia. I'm fairly confident that the Russians have done everything they can to secure Sochi, as we've heard, and they've been working with the U.S., although, albeit with some difficulty in other countries in dealing with the terrorist threat. I think it's quite possible that there will be some incident somewhere else in Russia during the period of the Olympics.
Serhiy, let's try to learn some more about this group that I suspect many people haven't heard of before, the Caucasus Emirate, led by the man I quoted earlier, Doku Umarov. Tell us about that group.
Well, that group was actually created, or that's not really a group. The Caucasus Emirate was proclaimed, announced, its creation was announced in 2007. Doku Umarov basically tried to show through the creation of this quasi-Islamic state that Chechnya and North Caucasus are now part of the global jihadist network of organizations, that it's not only about necessarily fighting Russia, but it's in participating in that global fight, the global jihad that was announced by Al-Qaeda and other Islamist organizations. Doku Umarov was claimed to be killed by the Russian security services. It's not clear whether he is alive or not, but obviously there have been statements made consistently on his behalf, and that organization remains very active. Russians were trying to conduct raids against the families of the members of this organization, or people who are allegedly connected to it. One of the tactics that they've used recently was exploding, bombing the houses of the families where these alleged members of this organization live. So by this, they were raising the costs basically for the potential recruits, for the young people, and the main source of recruitment are the young people, raising the cost of their participation in this group. But another very troubling sign that became clear after the Volgograd bombings is that they actually have an ability to recruit ethnic Russians who are converting into Islam and who are easier to basically conceal within the Russian cities, and who may go around with their daily lives, having regular jobs, but then at some point they will blow themselves up in a bus or in the train station, as we saw in Volgograd.
Matthew, let me follow up on one part of that answer that I heard, which is the notion that this group is now part of a global terrorist network as opposed to something specific to that region and that cause. Do you agree with that?
In part, yes, but I think we shouldn't go too far. We can remember that here in Canada, within the last couple of years, there was a case of two young Canadian men who were found to have been participants in an attack on an oil refinery in Algeria. And those young men had no particular connection to, in their past, to radical Islam or to even to any Islamic ethnic group. They later converted to Islam, as Serhiy mentioned. I think what we need to be aware of is that, to some extent, there is a convergence of global protest movements focused on radical Islam, and in the case of the North Caucasus, particular grievances against the Russian government, the governments of the regions in which these people live, and their anger about rights abuses. So yes, I would agree with Serhiy that these radical Islamists are, and to some extent identify with, global jihad, but we should be mindful that the origins of the terrorist incidents can be found mainly in the region itself. So
I hear a confluence of two different trends, if you like, coming together for this particular Olympics.
Here's how I would see it, or the analogy I would make. If we go back 40 or 50 years ago, Marxism was a much more potent ideological force in the world, and many people around the world identified with it, not just the Soviet Union, but left-wing people in North America and Europe. Some of those people became terrorists. They all called themselves Marxists. They belonged to different organizations. Their exact connections with one another are complicated and in some cases rather tenuous. And I think that may be an approximate analogy for the relation between radical Islamists in the North Caucasus and global jihad.
Gotcha. I think I heard somebody trying to get in a moment ago. Who did I cut off there?
It was me. It was Catherine.
Please go ahead, Catherine.
From Stanford. Sure. I just wanted to pick up on a few things that Matthew and Serhiy and Angela have said, and perhaps develop these a little bit further. I mean, one thing I think that's become particularly problematic with Chechnya and Dagestan and this Islamicization is that, you know, initially the conflict didn't start out as an Islamic conflict. It was a conflict really about independence and nationalism, and this little sliver of land, Chechnya, about the size of Rhode Island, the state of Rhode Island here in the United States, wanting to leave Russia, and they declared their independence in 1991 as the Soviet Union was falling apart. The first Chechen conflict between 94 and 96 under President Yeltsin was very brutal, and the Russian military didn't do particularly well during that conflict, but by 1996 there was a very unsteady peace, and then Mr. Putin himself went back in 1999, and the conflict was declared over in 2000. But it's been bubbling at this low level since 2000, and we really saw in the second stage of the conflict the Islamicization come up. And, you know, they don't speak Arabic in Chechnya, but in one of their first and most dramatic terrorist attacks in Russia, this group of rebels of about 40 or so terrorists took over a theater in downtown Moscow in 2002, and during a performance, and about 300 or so people were killed in the rescue attempt, but and all of the terrorists allegedly were killed. But to actually come right into downtown Moscow and grab a theater during the middle of a live performance was incredible. And then since then we've had major attacks in 2004 on the first day of school in Beslan, which is also in southern Russia. Again, the terrorists have been able to bribe their way through, as Angela mentioned. So you start to see some of the corruption and the effects of corruption, and how corruption has helped terrorists be very, very successful with some of these major attacks, including some of the so-called Black Widow attacks that were already mentioned. Since 2002, 2004, we've seen bombings of the Moscow metro, again, all successful. The bombings at Domodedovo Airport, which Angela mentioned, and then since then another bombing in the Moscow metro, and then these Volgograd bombings. So, you know, they've been successful, unfortunately. And they're at least using, or perhaps even being coached by, some of radical Islamist movements in other parts of the world. But the conflict didn't start out that way. The other thing I think we should talk about in terms of other targets are, you know, if you look at where Sochi is on a map, getting to Sochi is not that easy. And so I think when you had asked earlier, was it such a good idea to put the Olympics in this place? Well, I just would be interested in knowing what the International Olympic Committee was thinking when they listened to this presentation, which I know was very impressive from Mr. Putin. He can be a very impressive person, of course. If they looked on a map as to where it is, it's not an easy place to get to. Infrastructure has been created by the Russians to get there, but you do have to do air connections through places like Kiev, through Moscow, through Volgograd. So, you know, on the route, as Angela mentioned, there are many opportunities for soft target attacks, so-called soft target attacks. And Ukraine is in a bit of turmoil itself, so I would worry a little bit about transiting through the Kiev airport, for example, even before you get to Sochi.
Angela, you wanted to pick up on that?
Yes, and don't forget, it's right next door to a disputed region of Georgia, which now has declared its independence and has been recognized by Russia. But there's also a Georgian element to this. Russian-Georgian relations remain very tense, not as bad as they were during the war, but they're still bad. The Russians also blame Georgians for fomenting terrorism in this part of the world. The Georgians are now sending a delegation to Sochi, but rather reluctantly. As I said, you have Abkhazia, you have this region which is a separatist region from Georgia, where there's also been violence and instability. So the neighborhood really is quite dangerous, and so I think spectators and athletes have to be aware of that as they go there. I would also point out, on this business about how connected are these terrorist groups, these insurgent groups, to al-Qaeda. Yes, of course, the roots of the conflict in the North Caucasus are domestic, but even in the late 1990s, Zawahiri, who is now the head of al-Qaeda after Osama bin Laden's death, he was in Dagestan. And at that point, the Russians didn't know very much about him. They asked around. The U.S. had information but didn't share it with the Russians. And we know what happened to him. He then left. He was apprehended by the Russians. And then he left and he went back. And we know what happened on 9/11. So one of the problems here is that, and you see that also in the attempts by the U.S. and Russia to cooperate on securing the Sochi site, we're very wary about sharing information with each other about these different groups. We saw that after the Boston Marathon bombings, and that's another reason maybe why it's been harder for Russia to deal with its terrorist problem, because it has kept much of the information that it has to itself and hasn't been willing to engage in enough of a dialogue with other countries that maybe also know things.
Well, for what it's worth, I know that the Russians are also angry with the Americans for the United States' unwillingness to share some of the intelligence that it may have about things coming up over the next little while, because, of course, that gives away sources and methods. And I guess one can understand why both governments, even if it's to save lives, don't want to give away some of those tricks of the trade, Professor Stent?
Well, I mean, I think that's true. And of course, we have an added layer of complication here, and that's called Edward Snowden. Since the Russians gave him political asylum, this has obviously caused a major problem in U.S.-Russian relations, and it does also relate to some of these issues about sources and methods and how you know things.
Mm-hmm. Senator, can I bring you in at this point? Because one of the things I think we still need some greater clarity on is how this conflict moved from a Chechen struggle of independence into something much more, admittedly, tangentially coordinated with, but part of, an Islamic, use the expression you want, neo-fascist or whatever. Pick your the expression you like. How it became part of that global war on terror. Where on the continuum in history would you point to, saying this is when the transformation happened?
Well, I would say it started in the mid-1990s. It started as the more secularist leaders of the Chechen independent movement, like Johar Dudayev, who was obviously a Soviet officer, who was not a very religious man by all accounts, and even his lieutenants, his deputies, were not very religious. They gradually trying to identify themselves, trying to separate themselves from Russia, from the Soviet Union. They looked for other identities, and Islam became that possible other lever that they wanted to use in the fight, in the struggle for independence. Of course, by mid-1990s, there was a growth of radical Islamists, of Wahhabists, who are sort of the fundamentalist Islamic organizations, groups that emerged in Chechnya. They were the hardliners, the most radical, the most extreme in their approaches they advocated in fighting Russia. But they were increasingly more influential as the softliners, the more more the leaders with greater links to the Soviet Union, the older leaders, were basically losing influence in Chechnya among the Chechen people. And of course, I think the first indication of their growing potency, of their growing strength, was the incursion into Dagestan in 1999, which triggered the beginning of the Second Chechen War, where you had Khattab and Basayev and others leading it. And as the Second Chechen War continued, I think the Islamists grew in strength, primarily because they could acquired a lot of financial resources from outside sponsors, from the states like Saudi Arabia, for example. They also acquired recruits, international recruits, who would come and fight in Chechnya. And gradually that movement spread into other republics in North Caucasus. And basically now the center of that activity is not Chechnya anymore. It's Dagestan, it's Kabardino-Balkaria, less so Ingushetia, but it really became a regional problem. It's not only a Chechen problem any longer.
So is this a case, as we look at the map of the region right now, Matthew Light, where these two groups, which on the surface you wouldn't think had that much in common, with one major exception, of course, but the enemy of my enemy is my friend? Is that the situation now?
Which two groups are you referring to?
Well, I would start with the sort of nationalist Chechen groups to begin with, that rebel movement, and now the Islamist movement, which on the face of it don't seem to have much in common.
Right. Well, I think maybe the way we could look at it is that the secular nationalist movement has been effectively defeated, and Islamists have become, to some extent, the only game in town for people who, for whatever reason, would like to use violence to oppose Russian rule in the North Caucasus. Maybe a further wrinkle of this is that there have been a number of spectacular terrorist attacks that my colleagues have referred to, but we should also remember that the violence in the North Caucasus continues on a daily basis at a much lower level. So there are a lot of terrorist attacks that don't get reported very extensively in the Western press. Well, shootings of police officers, localized bombings of official targets, and the corollary, of course, is serious human rights abuses committed against local political activists, even some who are not at all involved in violence. So the way I would interpret what's been going on is that radical opposition to Russian rule in the North Caucasus has become more radical and has become less confined to the Chechen population, and it's taken on an Islamic or Islamist coloring or set of focal points or identification.
Angela Stent, follow up on that, if you would, on this angle. If you're an average citizen in this part of the world, and you think that your region/country ought to have more power away from the Russian Federation, but you're not religious and you're not particularly enamored with Al-Qaeda or Islamism, are you still for them because they're taking on the Russians?
Well, I mean, I think that you'd have to discuss that really on an individual basis. I mean, I think certainly the conflict did not start off as a religious one. It was, again, secular. It was nationalist. It was people wanted their own independence. I mean, there are many shades of opposition to rule from Moscow. It is true that most people who visit that region, the North Caucasus, say that large part of that region are really no longer really in the Russian Federation, although they are legally. They're really like the inner abroad, that Sharia law applies, that this is how many people live. They don't observe Russian law. So I think we have to understand this is a region which, while legally still part of Russia, is in many ways sort of outside the purview of Moscow. And certainly in Chechnya, you have a very brutal leader now who's taken charge. The war is over there, but has imposed his own rule on a country. But I'm not sure that they listen very much to what Moscow wants. So for those people who don't want to be ruled from Moscow, but who reject radical Islam, they may have their own groups, but there's no real organized movement for them anymore. This is a very fluid situation, and as Matthew said, there are daily incidents of violence all around this part of the world. There's an insurgency going on there all the time. It's never gone away. It's just that it's much greater now in Dagestan, some other places, than it is in Chechnya. So this whole region has been in turmoil essentially for almost 22 years.
So Catherine Stoner, let me put you a little bit on the spot here by pretending that you're Vladimir Putin's national security advisor. And on the one hand, you understand his political desire to keep these regions part of, or at least ostensibly part of, the Russian Federation. But on the other hand, you're not thrilled about the idea of bombs going off in movie theaters in Moscow. What would you advise him to do?
Mr. Putin keeps his own counsel, I think, and he certainly takes advice to some degree, but you know, he has a vision for Russia, and so most people within the presidential administration are in lockstep with that vision. And the vision is Russia intact, and this little region, Chechnya, is not going to walk out of the Russian Federation formally. In the early 90s, Russia had a lot of trouble with regions that wanted to live. Russia has over 80 provinces, and almost half of those are ethnic, well, about 20 of those are ethnic republics like Dagestan and Chechnya. So there are other Islamic republics within the Russian Federation that have not gotten violent in demanding more sovereignty and independence from Moscow. Only Chechnya has declared itself completely independent and tried to leave. So there is a big difference there. I think the Islamicization it's a big issue, and one of the things I know, since you're asking me to be national security advisor here to President Putin, one of the things I know that Russia is trying to do, and Angela and I attended a conference in Russia that Mr. Putin also attended at the end of September. One of the things Russia is trying to do is to re-establish its national identity by being inclusive and by not including everyone, of course. So the LGBT community in Russia is not really part of this vision, but certainly Islam is, and Russian Orthodoxy. And so one of the sessions that was at this conference was held in a monastery, but there was a rabbi there and a senior cleric from the officially recognized branches of the Muslim I guess church as well. You know, I think preaching inclusion of these different groups and terrorism is bad, and Mr. Putin's instinct is to use force. And he rather infamously said in 1999, when he went back into Chechnya, "We will bomb them in their outhouses." And they did. And so part of the reason for the radicalization is the brutality of the Russian response to the Chechen nationalist movement. But again, Russia was looking as a demonstration effect. They are concerned about the other 20 regions that are also ethnic republics that could potentially leave Russia. So he's not going to let Chechnya go, and there's nothing any advisor can do to tell him to just let it go. They've also, I should note, since I think we're all in pretty vehement agreement on most of these issues, I'll just try to create a little controversy with Angela and say that she'll remember, of course, that the current president of Dagestan is a fellow named Ramazan Abdullatipov, who is very much appointed by Moscow and is a very capable servant of Moscow. He's certainly been in Russian politics a very long time and a capable administrator. So the question is, how much help are you going to give someone like that to fight this low-level insurgency? And as we know in the United States, terrorism is a very, very difficult thing to contain. And you really have to show people an alternative vision, especially young people in Dagestan and Chechnya. These are regions that have very high birth rates. So you have to show them an alternative vision that, you know, you don't have to go blow yourself up. We can get you a job. And that's sort of a broader problem, I think, within Russia, as their economy looks really rather different than it did when the Olympics were awarded in 2007. Then the economy was booming. Growth was 8% of GDP on average year on year between 2002 and 2008. And now Russia is, you know, in 2013, GDP growth is 1.5%. There's not a lot of economic activity in Dagestan, Chechnya, Ingushetia, this part of Russia in particular. So that's a problem, and Mr. Putin would have to, of course, take that into account in trying to solve this problem in the longer term.
Okay, let's assume that Vladimir Putin...
Could I just add something to that?
Well, I want to set it up if I could. Give me 20 seconds to set it up in what I hope will be a humorous fashion. Vladimir Putin has heard that advice from Catherine Stoner. He's not impressed. He's fired her as National Security Advisor. Angela Stent, he now wants you.
I'm not sure I'd ever get the job anyway, Steve, I got to tell you. He's not one of my biggest fans.
Okay, so Professor Stent, you've now got the job. Would you advise Vladimir Putin that, yes, there is a military solution to his woes?
I think, I think what I would do if I were then to replace Catherine, because she was too radical, is to actually go back to something else that Catherine and I heard at this conference this time, and it directly relates to Sochi and all the other issues. That is to say, Mr. Putin has now put Russia forward as the leader of the conservative international movement, and very explicitly appealing to Muslims and saying, we believe in traditional Christian values, we're against same-sex marriage, against all these LGBT laws that they have in the permissive laws they have in the West, and we and the Muslims together, we're going to kind of rule the world. So he's made that direct appeal to them. He hopes that this will help calm the situation there. I don't really think saying, well, we share the same values as you and not the values of the decadent West, I don't think that solves the insurgency problem. But that's your appeal both to your domestic Islamic population and to the international Islamic population, hoping that that will temper some of their criticism of him. In fact, he was on one of the Sunday talk shows a couple of weeks ago in the United States saying that 70 countries in the world have laws on LGBT issues similar to those of Russia, and he added in 7 of them they execute people. And then he was trying to show that the West, the United States and the Europe and the Canada obviously are in a minority here. So I would probably advise him to continue with that, because I think by now the Russians have understood, the Kremlin's understood there is no military solution to this. They had, a long war in Chechnya, 2 of them. Chechnya is now quiet, but for how long? And to maybe try and appeal by some other means, although I'm not sure that's going to work.
As we try to further understand what Mr. Putin wants to do vis-a-vis the role Russia should play in the world, Matthew, I'm going to read this here from Ariel Cohen of the Heritage Foundation, and then get you to comment first on this. This is on Putin's top geopolitical priority. Vladimir Putin famously said in 2005 that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century and a genuine tragedy for the Russian people. While focusing on the post-Soviet erosion of Russian power and the rise of the U.S., NATO, China, and India on the global stage, the Russian leader disregarded the quest of the 14 former Soviet states for independence. In an article in Izvestia in October 2011, Putin proposed forming a Eurasian Union as part of his presidential election campaign. He envisioned integrating Russia and ultimately all of the former Soviet republics, except the Baltic states, by removing barriers to the flow of goods and people within a common economic space, and by harmonizing domestic and external policies and legislation. What do you think Mr. Putin is up to here with this so-called Eurasian Union?
Well, he's pushing it quite hard at the moment, and in part that coincides with the attempt by the European Union to promote its own alternative vision for the partial integration of a number of post-Soviet republics into some form of association and free trade agreement with the EU. I'll let Serhiy comment in more detail on the situation in Ukraine. Of course, that's been the most dramatic example of a place where the EU's association agreement has been contested by President Putin. But we see similar dramatic confrontations right now in Moldova, although so far not violently, and also in Armenia, where I just was, and where the issue of customs union entry or association agreement with the EU was apparently reversed by a presidential decision last fall. After 3 years of saying he was going to push Armenia into an association with the EU, President Sarkisyan abruptly changed his decision and said that Armenia would now enter the customs union.
What do you think of that idea?
Well, it's an interesting one for Armenia to undertake, because under his own leadership, he has said that Armenia's major export partner is the EU, and this should be promoted. So clearly something has happened to make him change his mind.
What was it?
Well, it's believed to have been fairly serious Kremlin pressure at a meeting that he had with President Putin last fall. And I think what that highlights is the tension between President Putin's ambitions for the regional architecture of the post-Soviet region and the desire by the EU and to a lesser extent NATO to expand their presence there.
Serhiy, does it look to you like Vladimir Putin is trying to recreate the Soviet Union?
Well, I would say in Ukraine and in general, I think in this analysts, among the analysts of Russia, there is a growing consensus that it's not so much about this positive objective of trying to create a new great power, which I think is impossible to do, but it's more of a negative project. It's an attempt by creating this quasi-integrationist association to prevent these other countries of the former Soviet Union from having closer ties with the West, with the NATO, with the European Union. And in the case of Ukraine, it's sort of a prime example of how that system works, because rather than just saying that we will prevent you through economic blockades or other sanctions from joining the European Union, Putin insists that, look, I have that other alternative for you that is much more attractive in many respects, especially in the short term. And for that reason, by joining the European Union, you will go against my interests and the interests of other allies that I have, like Kazakhstan, like Belarus, and so on. So it's not so much about an attempt to recreate a new great power, but it's really about maintaining some of that influence that Russia still has in the near abroad.
Let's put up yet another map here on the program. You all know what the EU is, the other EU. Here's a new EU that Vladimir Putin has in mind. This is the Eurasian Union, and it's color-coded here, and I'll just take a moment to go through it for those of you who are out of town and can't see it. In red, of course, the member states of this Eurasian Union, as Mr. Putin sees it. The potential members to join are the kind of olive countries, olive-colored, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan in the bottom right-hand corner, Ukraine to the top left, and pretty clearly those unwilling to join, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Georgia, as we've discussed already. Catherine Stoner, as you look at this, what do you think is the play here for Mr. Putin?
I don't think it's accurate to say he's trying to recreate the Soviet Union. The Soviet system was a very particular system of economics and social order and politics, and he's not trying to do that. And so his 2005 remark about it being a geopolitical catastrophe, he would say is more about the aftermath and the recovery. Not so much that he misses that system, although, you know, I have heard him, as have others, say things like, you know, there's much to be proud of in the Soviet past, and not everything was bad. And I actually think there are a lot of Russians who know that's the case. He's really, I think, trying to reestablish what he views and many Russians view as their quote-unquote natural sphere of influence and interest. And Ukraine is clearly a part of that, as is Georgia and Moldova. In fact, he would probably extend it all the way into Eastern Europe as far as Poland. Don't forget that the Russians have been very, very upset about U.S. anti-missile bases going in different parts of Eastern Europe, even though the U.S. has tried to reassure them those aren't aimed at catching your missiles, and you know they couldn't actually catch your missiles anyway, Russia. That's not the way the Russians see it. And so I know my colleague here at Condi Rice at Stanford, when she was Secretary of State, tried until she was blue in the face to tell the Russians that this isn't about them. But that's not the way they see it. And they see NATO and the United States and now the European Union coming closer and closer and trying to their border, the Russian border, and this natural sphere of influence. Central Asia is really rather different than Ukraine and Moldova and Belarus and Georgia. The Central Asian states really have no hope of ever joining the European Union. So I think that's not the issue. The issue really is, Russia sees Ukraine as very important in a cultural sense. I'm not saying the Ukrainians would agree with this at all. In fact, I know many, including I'm sure Sergei, would vehemently disagree, but that's the Russian perspective, at least I think within the decision-making community. This is ours. It's important for us to maintain Ukraine within Russia. The last really quick thing I'll say about that as well is that for the president of Ukraine, his personal interests, I think we're now seeing run against the national interests of the Ukrainian state. Ukraine had been negotiating this EU agreement, trade agreement, for 5 years, and then he suddenly decides, after conferring with Mr. Putin several times, that he's not going to do it. And then he's given a $15 billion promise from Mr. Putin as an alternative to the EU. The EU is asking him to go through major macro economic reforms that would really crack down on things like corruption and money laundering and the like, and human rights abuses. This is problematic for the president of Ukraine because he personally has benefited a great deal from these blurry lines between state ownership and private business, and his family has as well. So, you know, Putin is offering him an alternative, which is you can continue to follow the model or the path that you're on already and keep that system in place, or you can make all of these painful changes in your macroeconomic policy that the EU wants. Which are you going to choose? And so you can see that Yanukovych is more inclined to choose the so-called Eurasian Union and the lifeline from Russia to serve his personal interests as opposed to those of the Ukrainian people.
Serhiy, let me get you to follow up on that, in as much as, given what we have seen in the streets of Kiev and in other places in Ukraine over the past few weeks, is it really possible to imagine Ukraine participating in this new Russian Eurasian Union? I mean, it could light a fuse, could it not?
Yes, and I do not think that Yanukovych is ready to even consider the membership of Ukraine in the Eurasian Union. The official announcement coming from the government last year was about the suspension of process of European integration. They basically said that we want to postpone it until we figure out our problems, our economic issues with Russia. There is no political force in Ukraine of any significance other than the Communist Party, which openly advocates the membership of Ukraine not only in the Eurasian Union but also in the Customs Union. And I don't think there will be one. All of the opinion polls are showing that a strong minority of Ukrainians are supporting the membership in the Customs Union, only 30 to 35%, while close to 50%, some polls show even more than 50% support Ukraine's membership in the European Union. So it will be a political suicide for any political force to openly advocate a membership in the Eurasian Union. And that's why I don't think it's really on the agenda right now or in any close period of time. One more thing I wanted to add is that it's clearly a political project for Mr. Putin, because he even promised a $10 billion bailout for Ukraine, even before he provided this $15 billion in December, for just considering the membership in the Customs Union and postponing the membership in the European Union. And if you ask the Russian people, and some of the polls that were just recently done show that the majority of the Russian people are actually strongly opposed to continued financial support of Ukraine or other former Soviet republics at the expense of the Russian budget. So here, the sort of these neo-imperial ambitions of Vladimir Putin go against the basic interests and the basic preferences of the majority of the Russian people.
Angela Stant, I literally have 1 minute left in our discussion, and I just have one more question for you. Do you think Russia today wants to be liked and admired on the world stage, or feared?
I think it first of all wants to be respected, and for Russians, respect is indistinguishable also or closely allied to fear. And I think one of the hardest things has been that Russia hasn't been feared for a long time. So I think respected, and as a subset of that, feared. I don't think the Russians care whether people like them or not, and in that sense they're different from some other countries, for instance the United States.
I thought everybody wanted to be liked. They don't, eh?
Well, certainly I don't think that's high on Mr. Putin's priorities. I think it's the respect and fear more important.
Gotcha. I want to thank everybody for participating in our discussion tonight from many locations around North America. Catherine Stoner at Stanford University, Serhiy Kudelia at Baylor University, Angela Stant, who's at Georgetown University but who joined us from New York tonight, and Matthew Light from the University of Toronto here in our studios. Thanks so much, everybody, for your participation.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.